Welcome, everyone. It's on behalf of Urbanomic and Sequence Press. We'd like to welcome Quentin Meillassoux to New York to present his book, The Number and the Siren. This text was translated with great care by Robin Mackay, and it's a distinct pleasure. The first time Quentin's work was published in English was in Collapse in 2007. And this is The Number and the Siren is the third book in the collaborative series of Urbanomic and Sequence Press. A couple of things I want to mention. If you came in, you came in by elevator, but there's another exit. If you can walk down 4 floors, then we ask that you exit in this corner. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So this evening I'd like to explain to you my aim, my theoretical project in The Number and the Siren, a decipherment of Mallarmé's coup d'idée. It is a sort of investigation into Stéphane Mallarmé's poem, which attempts to continue, but at the same time to modify, a certain tradition of commentary on the poem. Since the post-war years, Mallarmé has without doubt been the poet most commented on by philosophers. Jean Hippolyte, the translator of Hegel, Sartre, Deleuze, albeit rather negatively, Lyotard, Badiou, for example, have all put forward commentaries on the coup d'idée, commentaries which have sometimes played a strategic role in their own apparatus of thinking. There is between French thinkers and Mallarmé, since the post-war years, a wholly singular relation, the like of which one does not find with other poets. My aim is not to take up once again this history, the history of Mallarmé reception, but to intervene in the context of such a heritage, at once philosophical and poetical, with a very specific thesis which concern what I would call a material fact regarding the coup d'idée, one that seems to me to hold a significance for its interpretation as a whole. Readers of After Finitude will no doubt ask why I became interested in the coup d'idée, what link this study could possibly have with the speculative positions that I develop concerning the necessary contingency of every being. There are many things that could be said on this subject, but there is no time to do so this evening. And in any case, they would remain incomprehensible so long as I have not explained the meaning of this poem according to my analysis of it. I would simply say the following, which is anyway entirely obvious. The coup d'idée is, as far as I know, the greatest poem ever to be dedicated entirely to eternal chance and to the role of the human, and specifically of the poet in Mallarmé, confronted with this dark absolute recognized by the modern. What strikes me then in this poet is that in the face of a chance held to be insuperable, he does not renounce his hope for what he calls the divine, a divine that takes on an extraordinarily original form that I shall try to unveil in what follows. This divine of Mallarmé, indeed, is nothing but the result of pure hazard. It is a materialist divinity, we can say, in the sense of Epicurean atomism, in which the gods exist, but only as material, hazardous results of atomic encounters. Materialism is not atheism, for materialism does not consist in denying gods, but in materializing them, and make them nothing more than the most interesting result of a nonsense becoming. We shall check that this materialist conception of the divinity is exactly the one of Mallarmé in the Coup de Dé. So let's come back to the investigation of my book. The material fact of which I spoke in relation to the Coup de Dé is a procedure of encoding. To state it quite plainly, I am convinced that Mallarmé's poem is coded. It is rather a delicate matter to say so, because raising the question of the code, of the secret code, of encryption, may seem like a fantastic thesis, above all in relation to a poet as hermetic as Mallarmé is. In doing so, I seem like a simple-minded novice to confuse the real difficulty of Mallarméan poetry with the childish idea of a secret whose key has been lost. What I shall try to show you, however, is that the Coup de Dé is indeed encrypted, and that there are very precise reasons to think so, and that the great interest lies not in what the poem encrypts, but in the very fact of the encryption itself. And the speculative interest of encryption is that the materialist divinization I spoke about is permitted by this encryption. What is totally original in Mallarmé is that he tried to use this question of encryption to resolve the problems of his epoch, which concerned, in particular, as we shall see, the question of metrics. That is to say, the question of the writing of poems according to regular forms rather than in free verse. Until the Coup de Dé, written in 1897 in its two different versions. Until the Coup de Dé, you must know that Mallarmé only writes poems in regular forms. That is to say, he adopts a metric linked to fixed forms, such as the sonnet, to fixed number of syllables, and to rhyme. He continues to do so even though he is confronted from 1887 onward with the new form, or the new refusal of form, that is free verse. That is to say, verse which for the new generation of poets, Kahn, Lafort, Grenier, no longer had to obey any count of syllables whatsoever, any established form, any rules of rhyme. Mallarmé, on the contrary, up until 1897, continues to abide by metrics, that is, in the strict sense, the counts of syllables, and in the wider sense, all the politic rules inherited essentially from the 17th century, with the marginal transformations that Romanticism had introduced. He does so even though he has a favorable opinion of free verse, whose modernity he rapidly comes to appreciate, unlike the Parnassians, who continue to condemn it as pure humbug. And then, suddenly, in 1897, everything explodes. And we have a poem, the Coup de Dé, even more audacious in form than free verse. The enigma is that there is no mediation between the strict metric of all Mallarméan poems, the audacity of which never goes as far as the transgression of free verse, and this stupefying poem of quite unabashed transgression, which no one really understands, not even the free verse poets, when it is published for the first time in 1897. In order to better grasp the meaning of this abrupt break between metrics and more than free verse, the Coup de Dé, I will try to show that the Coup de Dé is in fact not a form, even an exacerbated form of free verse, that it is not an intensified refusal of metricity, but that it proceeds from another logic entirely, and that the only way to understand this logic is by way of the discovery of a procedure of encryption. For it is this procedure, as strange as it may seem, that will deliver to us the meaning of this extreme break. Let me assure you that this interpretation does not come from nowhere. Neither is a product of the more fanciful contingent of Mallarmé readers, there are always some, who like to discover in him a gimcrack esotericism, Kabbalah, or some ancient wisdom or other. Rather, we situate ourselves in the wake of a singular proposition, that of the linguist Mitsurona and the mathematician poet Jacques Roubaud, who were the first to understand, with their 1980 republication of the poem, that the coup de dé must contain a procedure of coding, and that the meaning of the poem lay in a paradoxical defense of metricity. As you will see, my interpretation is not at all the same as theirs, but Roubaud and Rona's thesis, which is very important, is that the coup de dé, which seems to be an extremely modern poem, a poem of the extreme abandonment of the metric, is in fact a defense of matter. It is a poem that defends a certain metric. However, unlike Rona and Roubaud, I do not believe that it is a matter of defense of the old metric, and in particular, as they say, of the Alexandrine, with its perfect 12 syllables, but rather of a new meter and of a new count. The coup de dé is a eulogy to counting in poetry, and an apologia for the thesis according to which what essentially distinguishes poetry from prose is that the poet is the one who counts, who calculates. He is the one who counts the syllables and rhymes in the verse and in the poet. He does not, the poet, calculate in the, he who does not calculate is a prosaist, but he who has always calculated, albeit in a rhythmic and not solely an arithmetical sense, and for whom every number counts, is the poet. This grounded, the coup de dé fundamentally speaks to the role of number in poetry and defends matter in a completely unprecedented manner. Now, in order that the thesis should be clear, I must begin with several reminders about the poem. The coup de dé comprises 11 double pages, which Mallarmé calls pages with a capital P, and which represent the formal unit of the poem. I will number these pages from 1 to 11 to help us locate ourselves within the text. The order of their reading is normal. The coup de dé begins from the top left, is read from left to right, and from top to bottom. But the lines of text are read across the whole space of the double page, not just across a single page. So that is indeed the double page that constitutes the unit of reading of the poem. One of the formal novelty is that on each line one must leap over the central abyss of the book, the fold, the central fold of the book, which is a symbol of the abyss, to finish reading. So what is the thread of the poem? The whole of the coup de dé seems to turn around the exposition, in barely suggested terms, of the scene of a shipwreck. A ship seems to have been wrecked in a storm, page 3.